He didn't even sit down, just stood there in his crisp $2,000 suit like some Wall Street wax figure, flipping a Mont Blanc pen between his fingers like he was about to sign off on a pizza delivery, not a legacy. We're cutting costs. Your role is non-essential. 5 words. That's all it took for a man who's been here 5 months to attempt to erase 19 years of my life. No preamble, no thank you for holding the line during 3 acquisitions, 2 international fraud audits, and the 2008 collapse. Just a line item on his spreadsheet to delete. I didn't flinch. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a gasp or a question. I closed my notebook, real leather, scuffed at the edges from years of war rooms and compliance summits, slid it aside and pulled out a single page. He barely looked at it, but he will. They always do, once it's too late. By the way, if stories like this hook you, real power moves, cold revenge, and watching arrogance unravel in slow motion, do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel, drop a like, and help us keep these stories coming. It means more than you know. Now, where were we? Yes, Paul Sargent, the prodigal number boy. He blinked when he saw the heading at the top of the page. Amendment to Syndicated Debt Agreement. Regulatory co-signatory provisions. In his world, all power lives in projections and EBITDA. In mine, it lives in footnotes and signatures, specifically footnote 11b2. But he didn't know that yet. His assistant, a fresh Ivy League grad who calls me ma'am like she's doing me a favor, stood awkwardly near the door, clearly expecting this to be over in 30 seconds. I looked at her, then at him. No words, just a slow, deliberate nod. Not out of respect, but pity. They think I built processes. What I built was a fortress. And today, they just blew a hole in their own wall. You see, during the 2008 crisis, when banks were collapsing and everyone else was panicking about liquidity and counterparty risk, I rewrote our debt structuring from the ground up. We had a $3 billion syndicated credit line spanning 6 institutions, all of which required a firewall against fraudulent attestations from rogue execs. So I drafted a clause. It mandated that any compliance signature on credit renewals or restructuring had to be co-signed by a certified, board-approved compliance officer independent from the CFO and CEO chains. That co-signer was me. Removing me from the org chart didn't just cut costs. It triggered a clause that none of them even remembered existed. And the beauty of it? It doesn't trigger with my firing. It triggers with the removal of my signature authority in the system, which Paul had already filed that morning. He probably thought this was a chessboard, that he was clearing pawns. What he didn't see was that I was the board. He was just moving pieces on something I built. The worst part? He didn't even look worried. Not yet. He still thought this was a conversation, a negotiation, some sterile little HR formality where I'd sigh, pack my plants, and be escorted out by security. Bless his heart. I stood up slowly, slid the page closer to him, just enough that he could see the red box I'd highlighted around the line. In the event of removal, absence, or termination of the co-signatory, the credit agreement reverts to cascading personal guarantees by corporate authority, commencing with the CFO. His hand hovered over it for a second, then pulled back like it burned. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I just turned and walked out of the glass box they call a meeting room now, heels silent on the cold tile, leaving him alone with the weight of what he'd just done. Behind me, the door clicked shut. And somewhere, maybe not today, maybe not even this week, but soon, very soon, someone's going to read that clause aloud in a very different kind of room. And Paul Sargent will finally understand that risk doesn't live in numbers. It lives in names. Mine, to be specific. 2008 wasn't a year. It was a fault line. I remember sitting in a broom closet they called a conference room, staring at Bloomberg tickers, bleeding red out while our CEO tried to pretend we weren't about to become collateral damage. Lehman had just cratered. One of our credit partners, Deutsche, I think, was already circling the drain, and every major institution was snapping shut like bear traps. I was 3 years into the role, still young enough to believe in policies, old enough to know policies weren't enough. What we needed was a fail-safe. So I built one. While the rest of the C-suite was restructuring exposure and polishing investor language, I was at my desk with a Red Bull and a yellow legal pad, drafting what would become the most quietly dangerous clause in the company's entire risk framework. We were renegotiating our syndicated credit line, $3.2 billion across 6 banks, stitched together like a Frankenstein loan. All eyes were on the interest rate floors, the LIBOR buffer, the collateral schedules. Mine were on human behavior. What happens when the next CFO panics? When a desperate CEO signs off on compliance attestations to keep the stock price alive another week? What happens when someone decides the rules don't apply to them? So I wrote the clause. In all matters pertaining to credit facility compliance, co-signatory attestation must include one independently designated compliance officer, approved by Board Resolution 04-56, not subordinate to CFO, CEO, or Financial Strategy Office. That wasn't just a paragraph. It was a loaded chamber, buried in the center of the document where only people like me ever look. But it passed. Unanimous board vote. Because back then, fear made people humble. They listened. And once that clause was embedded, I made sure my name was hard-coded as the board-approved co-signer. Not out of ego, out of strategy. Because I knew someday the company would grow forgetful, arrogant, sloppy, and some hotshot would walk in with a 2-year plan and no clue what any of the architecture actually did, like Paul. I watched him during his first all-hands call, gray suit, buzzwords, toothy confidence. We're moving into an optimization phase, he'd said, like that meant anything. The guy knew margin splits and quarterly ratios. But debt structuring, regulatory firewalls, risk triggers, he might as well have been reading IKEA instructions in Braille. It's funny, they always think compliance is reactive, that we show up after the mess. But real compliance, the kind that actually works, is preventative. It's unseen, and it only matters when someone breaks the glass. Paul just shattered the whole cabinet. He thought he was saving the company money. What he did was remove the one regulatory seal protecting every executive from personal liability. The clause doesn't care about intent. It doesn't care about restructuring or synergy or any of the pretty words they throw into earnings calls. It only cares about designation status. Remove the co-signer, and after 48 hours of no replacement, the agreement flips. Exposure rolls downhill, starting with him. That's the part no one reads, the penalty logic. Because when I built that clause, I wasn't writing policy. I was writing prophecy, and he just fulfilled it. The whispers started before I even cleared my desk. First, it was Miranda from legal, cornering me by the elevator like she was trying not to be seen talking to me. "Off the record," she said, holding a manila folder like a damn crucifix. "That clause you referenced, it's real?" I didn't blink. Section 11, Sub B, footnote 2, ratified April 2009 during the second board summit in Geneva, cross-referenced under the Regulatory Liabilities Index. Her mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish out of water. She nodded, turned on her heel, and disappeared faster than she arrived. By lunch, I'd had 4 more casual encounters. Treasury, legal ops, even internal audit. People who normally wouldn't risk a hallway nod were suddenly bumping into me at the coffee machine, asking questions they weren't supposed to ask. Wait, are you saying he triggered it just by removing you from the compliance roster? There's no way this still applies, right? They would have updated the language after the 2015 refinancing, no? Except they didn't. I made sure of that. Every time they tried to tinker, I embedded continuity language. Every rollover agreement referenced the original clause. It's like changing the lock on your front door, but the deed still says I hold the master key. And still, while the cracks started to form below, Paul stood above it all, grinning, sipping dry brute from plastic flutes, raising a toast to bold leadership decisions and next-gen financial agility. He even quoted Churchill, which was somehow both ironic and insulting, given that the man just walked blindfolded into a war zone he didn't understand. "We're not just trimming fat," he declared, arm around a visibly uncomfortable HR director. "We're clearing runway for innovation." I watched from the back of the room, invisible now, the same way I used to be before they realized I was the only one who actually read the footnotes on our global risk profile, the same way I was when I embedded the clause. One line at a time, knowing full well no CFO would ever truly appreciate the elegance of regulatory foresight. It's almost poetic. They thought firing me would eliminate a cost center. What they did was detonate the tripwire on a multi-billion-dollar compliance structure. It reminded me of those war movies where the guy cuts the blue wire, grinning, thinking he's defused the bomb, right before the real trigger ticks over. Paul hadn't even heard the tick yet, but the clock had started, and everyone who mattered, they'd started checking their calendars, their contracts, and their assets. Because when the clause flips, it doesn't just impact the company, it follows the signatures. Personal liability, real exposure. No indemnity if compliance was knowingly dismantled. And guess what the system logs show? Timestamp, 9:02 a.m., designation removed by Paul Sargent. No backup named, no replacement filed. No one stops to ask what compliance protects until the wolf's already inside the fence. But by then, you're not making policies. You're just watching them work. Monday arrived like a hangover no one remembered drinking for. The party was over, the flutes were gone, but the aftertaste of arrogance still lingered in the air. The office felt off. You know that feeling before a thunderstorm, when the humidity sticks to your skin and everyone's pretending not to notice? That was the mood. Quiet, sharp glances. The kind of silence where even the printers seem afraid to make noise. By 10:17 a.m., legal had called 3 internal meetings, none of them scheduled, none of them public. I wasn't on the calendar anymore, but my name kept echoing down the hallway like a bad omen. Someone forwarded me an internal Slack thread, anonymously, of course. Just one message stood out. Wait, she was the final signatory on the Q3 rollover, right? The one tied to the compliance trigger? Yes. Yes, I was. Let me paint it plainly. When the company renewed the $3.2 billion syndicated loan last quarter, it wasn't just a matter of uploading a few PDFs and shaking hands with the bank reps. It was a layered operation, stitched together with exacting precision and regulatory vetting. And my signature wasn't ceremonial, it was structural. The attestation of independent compliance authority wasn't just policy. It was required by 5 out of 6 syndicate banks as part of our creditworthiness framework. My signature was the regulatory seal. Without it, the agreement was a loaded gun, safety off. And Paul? He pulled the trigger Friday morning. Around 11:40 a.m., the call came in, a direct line from Northern Capital, the lead lender on the syndicate. Their compliance officer didn't waste time. "We're seeing a role termination on a critical signer," he said, voice flat. Was this intentional? Paul didn't have an answer. He stammered something about reorganization and pending backfill, but the damage was done. See, in regulatory terms, once the designation is removed in the system without a simultaneous board-approved replacement, the 48-hour window opens, and once that expires, Clause 11B2 activates. Exposure rolls downhill. I imagine Paul sitting there in his glass office, phone pressed to one ear, flipping through a printed org chart like it would magically unfire me. Legal pacing behind him. Probably rereading emails, trying to reverse time via Outlook. But time doesn't bend for incompetence. They'd stripped my access by noon Friday. The clock had started ticking before most of them hit their second mimosa. And now, Monday morning, the banks were watching the timer hit 0 with popcorn in hand. Paul called in legal. Legal called Treasury. Treasury tried to call me. I didn't answer. Because here's the thing. I'm not angry. I'm not even smug. I'm patient. I knew this moment would come. It always does. With men like him. Men who think confidence is a replacement for caution. Who treat legacy infrastructure like obsolete code they can delete without debugging. By 2 p.m., there was a full-on fire drill. Email freezes. Compliance reviews. HR issuing retroactive change logs, trying to plug the hole like duct tape on a pressure valve. It was already too late. The clause doesn't forgive intent. It recognizes action, and the action was clear. Friday morning, 9:02 a.m. User, PS Argent action. Remove compliance officer designation for my name system log archived. Clause triggered. And no amount of PR spin or legal euphemisms could unpull that pin. They wanted lean operations. They got a live grenade instead. Tuesday morning, 8:06 a.m., boardroom 17A. Mahogany table, overpriced water bottles sweating onto leather coasters, and one too many suits pretending to be calm. The air was heavy, but not with confusion. This wasn't that kind of mistake. This was dread, and dread has a sound. It sounds like general counsel clearing her throat before she reads from a document nobody in the room expected to matter. In the absence of dual signatory attestation, credit liability shall cascade to C-suite executives in descending order of corporate authority, as defined by the active leadership matrix at time of breach. Silence. Commencing with the chief financial officer. The paper in her hand trembled slightly. I wasn't in the room, of course. I didn't need to be. People had started looping me into messages with no text, just CCing me like I was a ghost they hoped might absolve them. But ghosts don't do favors. They haunt. Paul stared at the line like it had just personally insulted his bloodline. You could practically hear his jaw tighten. He tried to play it off. Well, that can't be enforceable. It's outdated. I mean, surely there's been a compliance refresh since then, right? Wrong. You'd think a CFO would understand the meaning of a ratified clause embedded into every rollover document for 14 years. But no. Paul never looked below the quarterly fold. He thought footnotes were for interns. He started dialing. Lawyers, external counsel, his old mentor from Boston who knew his way around financial liability. You know what none of them could do? Undo time. The clause had a 48-hour sunset provision. Replace the designated cosigner within that window, and the compliance firewall holds. Fail to do so, and personal guarantees activate automatically without further notice. It's not a suggestion. It's not negotiable. It's a trigger written in legal steel. And the best part? His name wasn't just first on the liability list. It was the only one confirmed to have authorized the compliance removal action, time-stamped, logged, archived. By noon, you could feel the shift. The way people stopped speaking in front of him, the way legal started whispering in corners, the way HR locked its door mid-afternoon. Paul was no longer the man with the plan. He was the man with a countdown on his chest. I watched all of it from the quiet corner of my home office, sipping coffee from a mug that still bore the company's old logo, the one we retired back in 2016 before the rebrand, before the startup bros took over. It reminded me of when the place still respected permanence, foundations, people who built things that outlived trend cycles. They tried calling me again, this time from an outside line. I let it ring. Silence was my answer now. Silence and the faint clicking of legal dominoes falling one after the other in a pattern I designed years ago. By 3 hours p.m., Paul was no longer at his desk. He was in a private room with legal and the COO arguing in circles over whether the clause could somehow be invalidated through board override. It couldn't. That was the other genius stroke. The clause had survived 3 board turnovers, 2 outside audits, and 1 failed merger, all because it was embedded as a non-negotiable debt condition. The banks didn't care about company politics. They cared about risk, and the moment Paul pulled my signature, he became it. His pride had drafted the memo. His ego signed the removal form. And now, his assets were going to be the first on the altar. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just watched. Quiet. Still. Because silence, when you're the architect, is not absence. It's gravity. Wednesday morning started with a single email from the bank. Subject line, Notice of Interim Liability Lock. No exclamation marks. No caps. Just that cold, quiet legal tone that tells you the world is about to shift beneath your feet. By the time Paul arrived, they'd already frozen his personal line of credit, pending review of executive collateral linked to the syndicate loan. The first domino had officially fallen. See, once the clause triggers, the banks don't wait for your version of the story. They follow protocol. And protocol in this case means minimizing exposure by pulling leverage from whoever's name sits at the top of the liability ladder. Paul had made sure of that himself when he logged the removal request under his own ID. His digital fingerprint was the spark. Everything else? Just engineered fire. At 10:41 a.m., Paul's phone buzzed in the middle of a tense board huddle. His wife. 3 calls back to back. He ignored the first 2. The third one, he answered, on speaker by accident. Paul, what the hell is happening? The escrow on Tahoe just collapsed. They said our finances are under review. What does that even mean? Dead silence in the room. He mumbled something about clerical error and internal systems glitch, but everyone knew. The kind of glitch that shows up when 6 banks decide you're radioactive. By lunchtime, word had spread. Fast. VPs started quietly forwarding updated resumes to personal emails. One manager in strategy sent out a calendar invite labeled Marketing Budget Sync that was actually a mass download of his files. HR was fielding whispered hallway check-ins like, hey, hypothetically, if someone were considering a transition, what's the exit window on equity vesting? People weren't waiting for impact. They were anticipating it. That's when you know it's real. When the flight instinct overtakes loyalty, and believe me, I'd seen it before. In 2008. In 2013, in 2017, always the same choreography. Silence, tension, then stampede. Paul tried to regain footing, called an emergency all-hands for Thursday, started drafting a leadership integrity statement with comms, but it was too late. No statement rewinds regulatory logs, no memo undoes what the banks had already flagged. High-risk executive designation, and in this case, personally liable. His Tahoe property was just the first to go under scrutiny. Next came his restricted stock units, tied up in the same risk pool. Then, a lien notice on his Florida condo filed quietly under escrow review, the kind of things a man like him never thought could touch him. I sat back and watched the code I'd written, compliance logic embedded across layers of documentation and automatic trigger language, do exactly what it was supposed to do. Not revenge, not sabotage. Response. People always assume that protecting a company means fighting threats from the outside. But the real danger? It's always internal. Hubris, impatience, people like Paul who treat safeguards like the bureaucracy and legacy like clutter. What he never understood is that I didn't build the system out of paranoia. I built it out of pattern recognition. I'd seen people like him rise before. Quick, arrogant, spreadsheet obsessed. They cut muscle thinking it's fat. They fire architects and hand hammers to interns. Then they act surprised when the roof caves in. And now? The structure was speaking for itself. I wasn't in the building, but my design still was. Every alert, every freeze, every resignation letter. All of it, just the system correcting itself, just like I intended. By Thursday, the emails turned desperate. Subject lines went from request for advisory support to urgent, immediate consultation requested. One board member even tried calling my personal cell twice, then texted, "We'd value your insight during this transition." Cute. Paul, of course, was nowhere to be found. Word was he'd flown to New York for discussions with external counsel, though the more honest version was he'd gone to beg his old firm for cleanup help and maybe a lifeboat. But no one was answering his calls now either. Once the banks see your name flagged under cascading exposure, you become an insurance liability in a suit. It's not personal. It's math. Meanwhile, the company was eating itself. They had no idea how to undo what they'd triggered. Their internal counsel wasn't equipped for this kind of clause, compliance-embedded credit logic with multi-layered banking implications. Please, that's not something you can patch with a conference call and a Hail Mary draft from Legal Zoom. So they came to me. Not directly, of course. That would be admitting fault. They went to the email address listed on the website of Lintel Risk Advisory LLC, my firm. Soft launched 3 months prior, complete with a 3-page white paper and the quiet blessing of 2 former syndicate bankers who now served as strategic partners. The request was formal. We would like to engage with Lintel Risk Advisory to explore remediation options related to Clause 11B and associated cascading liabilities. Your unique familiarity with the original credit architecture places your firm in a highly qualified position to assist. Translation. Please fix what we broke. I responded like any good consultant. Cordial, professional, detached. I no longer represent the company in any capacity. However, Lintel is open to a limited engagement advisory agreement. They asked for terms. I gave them 3. My rate, 3 times my former salary, billed monthly, plus performance-based incentives. All compliance documents, board reports, and renewal structuring to route through my office exclusively. I am reinstated, not as an employee, but as the permanent signatory authority for all syndicated loan attestations. Irrevocable, board-proof, embedded by amendment. They balked at first. Of course they did. Pride is stubborn, even when it's broke. But by Friday morning, 2 more banks had escalated to Phase 2 risk procedures, which included freezing departmental budgets and putting a soft cap on the company's short-term liquidity access. Translation: if we don't fix this, we stop operating by next quarter. They called again, this time from a boardroom. We're ready to move forward with your terms. No apologies, no acknowledgement of what it cost them to get here. That's fine. I wasn't looking for validation. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for leverage, and now I had it, formally, contractually, and permanently. No more dotted lines, no more scrambling to justify a legacy title to a new exec every fiscal year. Just one clause, one name, and a compliance framework built not on trust, but on memory. Mine. Paul showed up late to the emergency session. No tie, collar slightly wilted, eyes bloodshot like he'd just crawled out of a deposition, which, to be fair, he probably had. He still walked like he mattered, still carried that CFO posture like the room owed him something. But the air around him had shifted. No more head nods, no more deference, just quiet calculations, people counting how close they were to the blast radius. He took his seat without looking at anyone. The board chair didn't waste time. He slid the amendment packet across the table and said, "Sign it, or keep bleeding." Paul let the silence stretch, fingers twitching beside the pen like it might bite. He scanned the front page, then the second. His eyes stopped on the clause that reestablished the co-signatory framework, under my name, under my firm, under terms that could not be altered without mutual agreement. Then he tried to pivot. "I still think this exposure assessment is inflated," he muttered, half to the room, half to himself. If we just walk the banks through the org changes and reframe the chair cut him off. Flat voice, no room for rebuttal. "They're not listening anymore, Paul." As if on cue, legal slid a printed notice across the table. A fresh one, from Northern Capital. Effective immediately, Paul Sargent, Chief Financial Officer of Harper Row Global Holdings, was personally liable for $740 million in cascading credit exposure. The window for executive indemnity had closed, and his name, thanks to his own action logs, was permanently indexed at the top of the list. That wasn't just a warning. It was a kill shot. He finally picked up the pen. Not like a man making a decision, but like a man surrendering to math. He signed. No drama, no speech, just ink. The chair took the file, closed it without ceremony, and nodded to legal. "We'll handle formal dismissal documentation before Cobb. For now, your access is revoked, effective immediately." Paul didn't stand, didn't protest, just stared at the tabletop, face hollow, maybe realizing that the house in Tahoe was gone, that his shares were in legal limbo, that the job he gutted others to get had finally gutted him back. I wasn't there in person, but I saw the update come through on the contract ledger. Status, executed. Authority, transferred. Designation, permanent. I sat at my desk, pulled up the compliance mirror copy, and reread the final line of the new clause, my clause. All modifications to the syndicated credit framework must be co-signed by my name, acting compliance architect under exclusive authority of Lintel Risk Advisory LLC. No exceptions. That was it. No speeches, no gloating, just language. Signed, notarized, activated, and Paul, he became a footnote, exactly where he belonged. 6 months later, the chaos had cooled, but the architecture remained. The funny thing about systems designed for longevity is that they don't need noise, they just need structure. I worked quietly from a converted room in my house, an old sunroom I'd turned into an office with warm lighting, no clocks, and an antique cabinet full of regulatory handbooks I hadn't needed in years, but refused to toss. Every morning, a packet of documents arrived digitally from Harper Row's new compliance liaison. New debt rolls, minor policy adjustments, audit prep forms, all routed through me now, not for input, for authorization, not as a courtesy, as a legal requirement. The clause had been reborn, rewritten in cleaner, sharper language, but its spine was still mine. All modifications to the syndicated credit agreement, risk assessment matrix, or compliance architecture shall require the express written approval of my name, compliance architect, as retained via Lintel Risk Advisory LLC. Terms are irrevocable without architect's signature. I didn't take calls from the board. I didn't attend quarterly reviews. I didn't comment on operations. I signed what met standards. I rejected what didn't. No explanations, no debates, just policy as it should be, rooted in expertise, not ego. Harper Rowe's internal team had stabilized, mostly because the new CFO actually read the clauses before touching them. Their market confidence rebounded. Quietly, I'd helped repair the very system that Paul almost annihilated. But unlike before, I wasn't in the org chart. I wasn't listed on the website. I wasn't a liability or an asset. I was a condition, a silent, immovable condition. The monthly wire hit like clockwork, 3 times what I used to make, and I didn't even have to step foot in that building again. Paul's name? Never mentioned. Not even once in the next 2 board meetings I scanned for signature logs. It was like he'd been airbrushed out of the company's memory, scrubbed clean, reduced to a lesson whispered between execs behind closed doors. A cautionary tale. Someone once asked me over coffee, "Don't you ever miss it? The office? The role? The recognition?" I stirred my drink and smiled. "Recognition is loud," I said. "Authority is quiet." What Paul never understood, and what too many still don't, is that risk isn't a line item. It's a shadow, and if you don't respect it, it'll own you. Turns out, risk is expensive unless you understand who holds the pen.